Welcome, listeners. Step into the dark, pull the curtains tight, and let the heavy noise of the waking world fade away. There is a comforting lie we all whisper to ourselves when we log online or walk down a crowded street. We tell ourselves that, beneath the chaos, there is a fundamental baseline of human decency holding society together. We assume that there is a line the strangers around us simply will not cross. We assume that human life holds intrinsic value. But every so often you stumble into a dark corner of the world, or a dark corner of the web, that shatters that illusion into jagged, irreparable pieces. Tonight we are going to walk through those shattered remains. We are going to examine a series of modern nightmares. These are the kinds of stories that do not merely disturb your sleep. They force you to confront the terrifying, bottomless depths of what people are capable of when they believe no one is watching. Or, in some twisted, modern tragedies, what they are capable of when everyone is watching. But before we step into the abyss, we need to talk about the doors you leave unlocked every single day. Imagine, if you will, a dossier, a thick, multi-page document sitting on a desk in a dark room. This document contains the exact coordinates of your past addresses. It contains the names of your loved ones, your private phone numbers, your estimated income, and intimate fragments of your life that you have no memory of ever sharing. This isn't the work of a stalker lurking in your bushes. This is the highly lucrative, perfectly legal work of data brokers. These faceless corporations harvest your digital footprint, package your identity, and auction it off to the highest bidder. They do not care who is buying your life. You can search your own name right now and watch as your privacy is advertised like a cheap commodity on a supermarket shelf. The entire industry operates on one arrogant, terrifying assumption, that you are too overwhelmed to stop them. They know regulation crawls while the internet sprints. It feels like a trap. We are handed a false ultimatum: either completely vanish from the modern world, or accept that your personal safety is the price of using a smartphone. We begin our descent by looking at the allure of virtual worlds. For many of us, there is a distinct, nostalgic comfort in digital escapism. The pixelated landscapes of early online role-playing games offered a shared sanctuary for thousands of lonely strangers. In those worlds, the rules are absolute. The path to success is clear. You climb the ranks, you reap the rewards, and you belong to a community. But recently, the digital landscape revealed a terrifying anomaly. A virtual world that was not coded by ambitious game developers or funded by a massive entertainment studio. It was a digital ghost town, meticulously constructed by the surviving remnants of a fanatic, doomsday UFO cult, a group the world assumed had been extinguished by time and tragedy decades ago. Welcome to the disturbing, labyrinthine rabbit hole of Siderella. To understand the digital ghost, we must first examine the physical monster. The year was 1966. The space race was dominating the global consciousness. Humanity was looking up at the stars with a desperate, romantic yearning. Paris, France, was swept up in the cultural phenomenon of extraterrestrial curiosity. Science fiction was king, and the newspapers were littered with reported saucer sightings. And wherever there is vulnerable curiosity, a predator will inevitably emerge to monetize it. A man named Jean-Paul Apple-Guéroy founded a group called Is-Eris. Apple-Guéroy was a charismatic charlatan who proclaimed himself the Grand Master. His origin story was a classic. Sci-fi girift. He claimed that during his youth, a blinding beam of cosmic light had pierced his skull, fundamentally altering his brain chemistry. From that moment forward, he alleged he was in direct, telepathic communication with highly advanced alien beings. These extraterrestrials had supposedly burdened him with a divine mission to shepherd humanity through an impending spiritual evolution. If you attempt to read Apple-Guéruy's philosophy, your mind will quickly start to bleed. It is a dense, impenetrable soup of pseudo-intellectual technobabble. He spoke of initiatic keys and inner vibrational orders. But stripped of the cosmic jargon, his core message was insidious. He claimed he was rescuing lost souls from the dark sewers of the collective unconscious, elevating their minds so they could join a supreme, intergalactic race. A race he chillingly referred to as the Cosmic Aryans. Whenever a charismatic leader begins invoking Aryan terminology, the foundation for disaster is poured. The original group formally dissolved in 1978, but the ideology simply mutated. It sprouted new heads under names like Galactius Futura, and eventually, Sidrella, a name rooted in the word Sidril, meaning of the stars. In these early, formative years, Applegate hunted for prey on college campuses and inside quiet, organic health food shops and esoteric bookstores. He didn't approach the strong. He targeted the isolated. He sought out individuals carrying the heavy baggage of broken homes and profound loneliness. Once he had their ear, the indoctrination began. He convinced these fragile recruits to abandon their lives, don flowing robes, clutch healing crystals, and move into secluded, communal living spaces. The path to enlightenment, of course, required purchasing his endless volumes of literature and expensive spiritual courses. By 1982, the Grand Master's grip was absolute. He orchestrated a massive exodus, moving approximately 200 of his most devoted followers across the globe to the tropical isolation of Tahiti in French Polynesia. They were building a utopian paradise beneath the sun. They spent their days meditating on the beaches, absorbing Appleguris endless, droning lectures, and watching the movie Star Wars on a loop. To Sidrella, George Lucas was not a filmmaker. He was a prophet who had been contacted by the aliens to document true, historical galactic events. But behind the tropical facade, Tahiti was a psychological prison. Thousands of miles away from their families, the followers were completely cut off from objective reality. In this fabricated vacuum, Applegate tightened the screws. He subjected them to intense, alternating cycles of psychological love bombing and severe deprivation. He dictated what they could eat, restricting their caloric intake. He deprived them of sleep, keeping them awake for agonizing stretches of time. He even forced them to communicate in a bizarre, childish coded language, severing their connection to normal human thought. Under the crushing weight of exhaustion and malnutrition, the followers began to hallucinate. They claimed to see glowing extraterrestrial entities walking among them. Ex-members would later confess that the guru hadn't unlocked their minds. He had simply ground their psychological defenses into a fine dust. And then the darkness deepened. According to the harrowing testimony of a former member named Isabel Sebagay, who was pulled into the cult's orbit when she was merely 17 years old, Applegate weaponized the group's spirituality for his own perverse gratification. To purge the darkness from their souls, female members were forced to participate in a ritual the Grand Master dubbed tantric transmutation. This sickening ceremony required the women to undress, form a circle around Applegate, and engage in group sexual relations with him. Only the women he personally selected were subjected to this horrific cleansing. While outside observers correctly identified Applegate as a predatory narcissist exploiting the broken for sex and money, the believers inside the tropical compound were blinded by faith, and that faith was soon weaponized by a terrifying prophecy. Applegate announced that his telepathic alien contacts had delivered a grim ultimatum. The apocalypse was imminent. The Earth was destined for destruction. Only those who had achieved the highest echelon of cosmic consciousness would be rescued by a fleet of flying saucers and transported to the safety of Alpha Centauri. This doomsday gospel was codified in a 1982 comic book titled Timeless Voyage, written by Applegate and illustrated by a cult member named Sergio Macedo. To the outside world, it was an obscure piece of French science fiction. To Sidrella, it was the Holy Bible. It sold 30,000 copies in France. It even briefly snared the legendary illustrator Mobius, who moved his family to Tahiti to join the sect before ultimately fleeing a year later, disgusted by the leader's tyrannical abuse. But the ink of Timeless Voyage bled far beyond the borders of Tahiti. The comic book found its way into the hands of an entirely different, infinitely more dangerous cult, the Order of the Solar Temple, or OTS. Led by Luke Chouarai and Joseph D'Amambro, the OTS was a wealthy, prolific Neo-Templar doomsday cult operating across France, Switzerland, and Canada. They, too, harbored a deep obsession with transcending the physical realm before the Earth's impending annihilation. When the leadership of OTS read Appleguris' comic, they did not see a story. They saw a tactical blueprint. But the OTS interpreted the ascension differently. They believed that the only way to board the alien vessels and reach the stars was to violently forcefully eject their souls from their mortal bodies. In the autumn of 1994, the cosmic delusion mutated into a bloodbath. The OTS leadership categorized their members into three distinct groups: the awakened who possessed the strength to end their own lives, the immortals who required physical assistance to die, and the traitors, those who questioned the madness. Two of these so-called traitors were Antonio and Susan Toit, a married couple who had dared to break away from the OTS. On the terrifying night of September 30th, a hit squad of cultists ambushed the couple in their chalet. The fanatics did not just murder the husband and wife. They turned their blades on the couple's 3-month-old infant, ritualistically stabbing the baby with knives and a wooden stake. The assassins then set the chalet ablaze, burning themselves alive in the purifying fire. Days later, the horror spread to Switzerland. Across to separate locations in COY and Salvan, 53 people were slaughtered. Some were willing participants, injecting themselves with lethal poisons, fully believing they were moments away from waking up on a spaceship. But forensics painted a much darker picture for many of the others. Evidence proved that several victims had fought desperately for their lives before being overpowered, sedated, and shot in the head. The compounds were set on fire. When the smoke cleared, authorities found the charred bodies dressed in ceremonial robes, meticulously arranged in star-shaped geometric formations on the floor. Including the Dutoit family, 53 lives were extinguished. The cult leaders had reportedly aimed for exactly 54 deaths, a sick homage to the 54 Templar Knights burned at the stake in the year 1310. As the ashes cooled, the philosophical link between the horrific OTS massacres and Applegure's timeless voyage became glaringly apparent. Appleguer immediately went into damage control, aggressively distancing himself from the Solar Temple, claiming he had absolutely no direct ties to their leadership. While that may have been technically true, the cultural damage was catastrophic. Panic regarding New Age cults swept through Europe. Survivors of Sidrella began stepping out of the shadows, bravely detailing the psychological torture and sexual abuse they had endured. French authorities officially branded Sidrella a dangerous, predatory sect. Appleguer, feeling the heat, executed a masterful sleight of hand. Rella seemingly evaporated. They rebranded as Azure Wellness. They retreated to Europe, purchasing a massive, secluded chateau, operating under the thin guise of a boutique hotel and restaurant. In reality, investigators strongly suspected it was simply a fortified commune for the remaining loyalists. The Grand Master lived lavishly, allegedly purchasing a fleet of pleasure yachts using the drained bank accounts of his followers. By 1999, the group officially notified the French government that they had ceased all operations. On paper, the cult was dead. But ideologies rarely die. They simply migrate to new host bodies, and Sidrella migrated into the wires. In 2001, the remnants of the cult launched a sprawling, text-heavy website. Thanks to the digital preservation of the Wayback Machine, we can peer back into their early digital defenses. The landing page was a staggering manifesto of victimhood, likely penned by Appleguer himself. He compared his public scrutiny to the brutal torture of the Cathars and the Templars during the Inquisition. He went about media lynchings and blamed his detractors as people who simply had a habit of failing. If you dug deep enough into the digital architecture of these sites, past the pseudoscience articles on reptilians and water-powered cars, you would inevitably stumble into the modern incarnation of the cult. A network of active sites, complete with AI-generated artwork, video testimonials, and an online merchandise store. But the true heart of the modern cult beats inside a platform, called Club Qualitative Life. This is the internal land. It is a fully functional, three-dimensional virtual world that has been quietly operating since 2011. It is, for all intents and purposes, a cult-controlled version of Second Life. If you create an anonymous account and log into this bizarre digital ecosystem, you are met with graphics that look entirely obsolete, a relic of early 2000s software. But make no mistake, the servers are alive. You can wander through the communication point, a sterile, empty digital plaza designed for open mic indoctrination. You can visit the virtual yacht club, populated entirely by lifeless, non-player characters standing frozen on a digital dance floor. But if you load into the Unitary Science Institute, the isolation is shattered. A disembodied, pre-recorded voice suddenly booms through your headset, a French voice, imparting convoluted cosmic wisdom on an endless loop. It is almost certainly the digitized echo of Jean-Paul Appleguer himself, speaking from the void. The Virtual Institute boasts a schedule of actual, real-world and virtual workshops, There are digital photo galleries showcasing massive groups of human beings, sitting in circles around physical crystals, still adhering to the dogma. But the most chilling location in the internal land is the Crystal Temple. If you walk your avatar into this digital sanctuary on a random Tuesday afternoon, you will likely not be alone. You will find other avatars sitting in perfectly silent, digital meditation. These are not bots. These are living, breathing human beings from Canada, France, Germany, and Argentina, tethered to their keyboards, communing in a cult-controlled server. When a curious investigator recently logged into the temple, an avatar immediately approached them. The digital stranger eagerly asked to move the conversation to Telegram, a highly encrypted messaging app. Once hidden behind encryption, the stranger confessed. They admitted they had followed outrage for years. They had met the guru in the physical world. They confirmed that the Grandmaster was indeed the architect of this virtual universe, praising it as a sanctuary for making special friendships. The stranger spouted the familiar, intoxicating rhetoric of the cult. We are only seeing 1% of reality. We hold the stars inside ourselves. We are destined to return to the cosmos. They warmly invited the investigator to join the evolutionary path. But the warmth was conditional. After logging in a few more times, the digital atmosphere turned hostile. The cult had noticed the outsider. A high-ranking user, operating under the name Sissy Austria, confronted the investigator. She demanded identity verification. When the investigator remained anonymous, the digital door slammed shut. The avatars remained in the Crystal Temple, meditating in silence, but they refused to speak another word. Driller did not die. It merely shed its physical commune and uploaded its consciousness into a virtual temple. To this day, Jean-Paul Outrage still commands a flock of devoted souls, their avatar sitting silently in a pixelated room, waiting for a flying saucer that will never arrive. We leave the quiet, digital isolation of the Crystal Temple and crash violently into the loud, chaotic reality of the modern streaming era. The internet has birthed a terrifying new breed of celebrity. We have cultivated an environment where attention is the ultimate currency, and for some, the pursuit of that currency completely overwrites their basic human empathy. This brings us to a 17-year-old boy from New Jersey named Vincent Battlora. To the casual observer, Vincent was just another face in the endless sea of aspiring content creators. He operated a YouTube channel under the moniker VinnyBet118. His digital footprint was entirely mundane, hours upon hours of live-streamed gameplay, featuring titles like Madden, MLB The Show, and Grand Theft Auto. When he did bother to engage directly with his small audience, Vincent carefully curated a specific persona. He painted himself as a polite, respectable kid raised in a good, upstanding suburban family. But that carefully constructed facade violently shattered on the evening of September 30th, 2025. On that night, Vincent booted up his streaming software and went live. But the audience waiting for him in the chat was massive, and they were boiling over with absolute, venomous hostility. Because less than 24 hours prior, the asphalt of a neighboring town had been stained with blood, and the internet had already connected the dots directly to Vincent's front door. Let us rewind to the previous afternoon, September 29th. The time was just approaching 5:30 p.m. The setting was Burnside Avenue, a deeply quiet, tree-lined residential street in the town of Cranford, New Jersey. The air was calm. To 17-year-old girls, Maria Niots and Isabella Saws were enjoying the late afternoon, riding together on an electric bicycle. They were on a simple, innocent errand to pick up Baba T. The tranquility of the neighborhood was obliterated by the roar of a combustion engine. A black Jeep Compass suddenly tore down the residential street, in a zone strictly marked for 25 miles per hour. The heavy SUV was redlining at a staggering 70 miles per hour. The Jeep did not swerve. It did not brake. It accelerated with terrifying, lethal purpose directly into the back of the electric bicycle. The impact was catastrophic. The sickening crunch of metal against metal echoed through the neighborhood. The kinetic force of the 2-ton vehicle hitting the girls at highway speeds was absolutely devastating. One of the teenagers was launched nearly 100 feet through the air from the point of impact. According to horrified eyewitnesses, the driver of the Jeep had not made a tragic mistake. He had parked down the street, quietly idling in the shadows, watching Maria and Isabella from a distance. He waited for the perfect moment before dropping his foot on the accelerator and turning his vehicle into a weapon. Following the impact, the driver desperately tried to flee the carnage. He mashed the gas pedal, trying to force the mangled Jeep away from the scene. But the shattered remains of the electric bicycle had become hopelessly wedged deep inside the engine block, grinding the vehicle to a halt. Forced to abandon the weapon, the driver kicked his door open and fled on foot. A nearby home security camera captured the chilling aftermath. The footage showed the suspect, a young male, not sprinting in a blind panic, but casually sauntering away from the massacre, his hands swinging by his sides as if he had just finished a pleasant afternoon stroll. First responders swarmed Burnside Avenue, their sirens wailing in vain. Both Maria and Isabella were pronounced dead upon arrival at the local trauma centers. The police ran the plates on the smoking, abandoned Jeep Compass. The registration fed back to a familiar address, the Battle Oro household. When the news reached Maria's devastated family, there was no mystery to solve. They knew exactly who was behind the wheel. Vincent Battle Oro had been subjecting Maria to a relentless, terrifying campaign of psychological torture for months. It remains murky whether the two teenagers had ever been romantically involved, but they shared the same high school hallways, and the animosity was a known, toxic entity. Vincent had bombarded Maria's phone with vile, vitriolic text messages. He aggressively threatened to leak intimate photographs of her to the entire school. The harassment had recently reached a fever pitch. Vincent had allegedly sent Maria highly illegal, explicit materials, prompting her to report him to the school administration. Vincent was slapped with a suspension. Terrified for her safety, Maria filed for, and was granted, a legal restraining order against him. But a piece of paper does not stop a predator. It only enraged him. Vincent escalated his war. He weaponized the local police force, calling in multiple false, anonymous reports that resulted in heavily armed officers raiding Mary's family home on at least 2 separate occasions. Neighbors reported seeing Vincent physically stalking her through town, his vehicle parked ominously outside her bedroom window in the dead of night. The warning signs were not hidden. They were broadcast live to the world. In the months leading up to the double homicide, Vincent had transformed his Vinnyback gaming channel into a dark, digital confessional, proudly identifying himself as an admirer of toxic, misogynistic internet personalities like Andrew Tate. Vincent would routinely pause his video games to rant into his microphone. He seethed with anger, branding Maria as a radical leftist, and openly, publicly swearing that he would enact his vengeance upon her. He confessed to his viewers that he suffered from blinding, uncontrollable fits of rage. This was a terrifying reality his own father knew all too well. Mr. Battle Oro, a retired police officer, had desperately called his former colleagues on multiple occasions, begging them to intervene as his son's behavior spiraled into violent psychosis. Just 4 weeks before the crash, Vincent had allegedly attacked his own father, spraying him directly in the face with chemical mace before stealing his car. Despite the restraining order, the stalking, the false police raids, the recorded death threats, and the frantic pleas of a retired cop, the system did absolutely nothing. They waited until 2 teenage girls were dead on the asphalt. At 6:10 p.m., less than an hour after the murder, investigators brought Vincent in for questioning. But the local police were inexplicably treating the targeted 70-mile-per-hour impact as a possible accident. After a brief interrogation, they let him go. They allowed a double murder suspect to walk out the front doors of the precinct pending further investigation. This baffling, immediate release sent shockwaves of fury through the local community. Whispers of systemic corruption ignited immediately. Vincent's father was a retired officer. More disturbingly, his uncle was the active police chief of a neighboring jurisdiction. The town demanded to know if strings had been pulled to let a killer walk free. The absolute moment Vincent returned to his father's home, he grabbed his phone. He typed out a hollow, performative post offering his condolences to the families of Maria and Isabella. And then, bathed in the glow of his monitor, he booted up his streaming software and, went live on YouTube to play a co-op video game. He wanted to play video games, while the blood of his victims was still drying on the street. But the internet had already mobilized. Local community pages and Reddit threads had pinpointed his live stream, directing thousands of furious, grieving people into his chat room to confront the monster in real time. The chat box scrolling down the side of Vincent's screen was a blur of absolute rage. "You killed my best friend. You animal." One user typed, "Rip Isabel and Maria, you monster. I'm coming for your head, boy. He's milking views, killer." Vincent sat in his gaming chair, staring at a wall of text accusing him of double homicide, and his reaction was a chilling display of absolute, sociopathic detachment. "I don't need negativity in the stream." Vincent twinned into his microphone, his voice dripping with annoyance as he began banning users. "So everybody's getting timed out. Why are we running people over? Everybody's messaging negativity, it's ridiculous." And then he articulated the dark, beating heart of the modern attention economy. He looked into his webcam and told the furious mob exactly why he was letting them scream at him. "Let me explain something real quick before I get the stream going," Vincent said, his voice devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. "The more you guys engage in the chat, the more you give me engagement, and I get paid for YouTube bomb. That's fine. You're just giving me engagement." He was monetizing the outrage over his own murders. He was watching the names of the girls he had just crushed with a 2-ton vehicle scroll past his face, and all he saw were dollar signs. As the stream continued, the pressure mounted. Vincent finally disabled the chat function, silencing the mob. He stared into the lens and delivered a measured, highly calculated statement. He alluded to misinformation spreading online. He attempted to cast himself as the true victim of the narrative. "I am not authorized to talk about the whole thing," he stated, his tone carefully controlled to avoid self-incrimination. "I wish my sincerest condolences to those 2 girls lost in that tragic accident. It is an absolute unfortunate situation, and there's more to the story that you're not getting. But when the time comes, I will explain it in greater detail." There was no crack in his voice. There was no tear in his eye. There was only the cold calculation of a predator trying to manage his public relations. The broadcast finally ended abruptly when a user managed to bypass his filters and do XXX his physical address directly into the stream. The charade could not last. The public pressure was a tidal wave. The very next day, October 1st, 2025, the authorities finally moved. Heavily armed officers arrested Vincent Battle Oro and officially charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecutors pulled no punches. They formally alleged that Vincent had meticulously planned and intentionally executed the murder of Maria Niotes. As for Isabella Salas, the prosecutors stated that Vincent simply viewed the innocent girl as an acceptable collateral loss in his quest for vengeance. The state immediately pushed to try the 17-year-old as a full adult, arguing that Vincent had purposefully rushed to commit the murders just days prior to his 18th birthday, calculating that the juvenile justice system would afford him a lighter sentence. His YouTube channel, the altar upon which he worshipped his own ego, was permanently terminated. If convicted as an adult, the boy who smiled at his chat will face 30 years to life in a concrete cell, where there are no cameras, and there is absolutely no engagement. For our final descent into the digital shadows, we travel across the globe to the sprawling, hyper-connected social media landscape of China. In the digital era, the avatar you present to the world is a mask. It is a carefully curated illusion designed to hide your flaws, project your desires, or, in the darkest of cases, conceal your fangs. In July of 2025, a specific, highly uncanny face went absolutely viral across every major Chinese social network. The face featured deathly pale, heavily filtered skin, and impossibly bright, painted red lips. To the millions laughing at the memes, it was just a buzz or internet oddity. But to an unlucky, undetermined number of men, this face belonged to Sister Home. And Sister Home was the architect of a psychological and financial meat grinder that systematically destroyed hundreds of lives. The physical reality of Sister Home's operation was bleak. Over the span of several years, a parade of young men had navigated their way to a dingy, subterranean, windowless apartment hidden beneath the bustling streets. These men arrived carrying humble, desperate offerings of affection, They brought heavy watermelons, packs of tissue paper, and half-empty jugs of peanut oil. They were men seeking intimacy, connection, or a brief escape from the crushing loneliness of modern life. They would sit in the dim, claustrophobic apartment, chatting softly with Sister Hong. Eventually, the guest would be directed to a small bathroom to wash up. When the man emerged, vulnerable and expecting intimacy, Sister Hong would lead him toward the mattress. If a guest felt a flicker of modesty and reached out to click off the harsh overhead lights, Sister Hong would firmly stop them. The room, she insisted, must remain perfectly, brightly illuminated. Sister Hong never fully disrobed. She maintained the illusion by wearing a long, flowing, incredibly loose skirt. She would position herself over the visitor, dictating the physical boundaries of the encounter. If a man, confused by the strange physical mechanics of the interaction, dared to voice that something felt inherently wrong, Sister Hong had a pre-packaged, sympathetic excuse. She would whisper that she was suffering from a painful medical condition, claiming she was severely swollen to deter any further physical investigation. It was a lie built on top of a lie, because Sister Hong did not exist. Behind the pale makeup filters and the flowing skirts was a 38-year-old biological male, known to the authorities only by his surname, Xiao. To be absolutely clear, official police reports indicate that Xiao did not identify as a transgender woman in his daily life. The persona of Sister Hong was a purely predatory construct. It was a digital bear trap, meticulously designed to lure vulnerable men into his windowless basement. Xiao's methodology was a masterclass in catfishing. He would apply heavy digital modification to photographs of himself, utilizing aggressive beauty filters on surgical face masks to convincingly present as a distressed, melancholic housewife trapped in a loveless marriage. He seeded these profiles across multiple dating applications, casting a wide net into the lonely digital sea. Once he had a target on the hook, he would play the victim, building a false emotional rapport. Then he would drop the bait, a rare, secret invitation to visit his apartment for a completely free, no strings attached intimate encounter. For hundreds of men, the offer was simply too good to refuse. What makes the psychology of this trap so fascinating to the Chinese media is the demographic of the victims. Many of the men who walked down those basement steps were young, highly attractive, and physically fit. Men the local tabloids crudely referred to as little fresh meat. These were individuals who possessed the social capital to easily find genuine, reciprocal relationships online. Yet, they chose to accept the invitation of the mysterious, tragic housewife. The cultural context adds a layer of complex tragedy. In China, homosexuality remains significantly less socially accepted and openly discussed than in many Western nations. As the scandal unfolded, fierce online debates raged regarding the true nature of the encounters. Did the men truly believe they were meeting a woman? Or, constrained by societal pressures, did some of these men secretly recognize Xiaoist Ru gender upon arrival, silently accepting the bizarre role of play as an unspoken compromise for forbidden intimacy? Regardless of what the men believed they were participating in, they were all entirely oblivious to the ultimate betrayal. Buried in the shadows of the brightly lit bedroom, the unblinking lens of a hidden camera was recording every single second of their vulnerability. Xiao was not running a Lonely Hearts Club. He was the CEO of a highly lucrative, illicit digital pornography empire. After a victim washed up, gathered his belongings, and walked out of the basement, believing his secret was safe, Xiao would extract the high-definition video files. He operated a massive, paid subscription service hidden deep within encrypted messaging applications. For a monthly fee of roughly $150 on about $20, thousands of anonymous voyeurs were granted access to Xiao's ever-expanding library of hidden camera hookups. For years, Xiao operated in the shadows, amassing wealth and a staggering collection of stolen intimacy. But the digital world is impossible to contain. The dam finally broke when a paying subscriber decided to rip the videos from the encrypted server and leak them, completely uncensored, onto the open internet. A victim stumbled across his own face on a public forum. The horror of the realization drove him straight to the local police precinct. But the match had already been thrown into the gasoline. Overnight, the bizarre, terrifying visage of Sister Hong now mockingly rebranded by the internet as the Raid Uncle, ignited across Weibo. The clips garnered hundreds of millions of views in a matter of hours. The internet did what the internet does best. It stripped away the humanity of the victims and turned a massive criminal violation into a viral circus. Wild rumors spread like wildfire, with claims that Xiao had successfully filmed 1691 different men. The number was chanted so frequently, it morphed into absolute fact in the public consciousness. Brands shamefully capitalized on the hysteria, slipping references to the Raid Uncle into corporate marketing campaigns. The tragedy was mutated into memes, crude parodies, and a torrent of vicious, homophobic vitriol. The authorities scrambled, issuing desperate public warnings, threatening severe legal consequences for anyone caught distributing the uncensored footage or attempting to publicly identify the men in the videos. But you cannot put the smoke back into the fire. The damage was apocalyptic. Vigilante internet sleuths compiled massive, high-definition collages of the victims' faces, blasting them across social media networks, actively encouraging wives and daughters to scrutinize the grids to see if they recognized their husbands or fathers. The internet ruthlessly categorized and mocked the victims. They identified a man they dubbed Mr. For seasons, a tragic figure who would return to the windowless basement for separate times over the course of a single year. Another victim, Leather Jacket Man, was successfully identified by his own social circle. The explicit video was mercilessly forwarded directly to his fiancée. She took to social media to publicly, unhumiliating lie announce the termination of their 3-year engagement. A prominent TikTok influencer, boasting over 1 million followers, was spotted in the leaked cache. In an instant, his carefully cultivated digital empire collapsed, his comment sections flooded with relentless mockery. Perhaps the most tragic figure to emerge from the digital wreckage was a local kindergarten teacher. The internet cruelly dubbed him Mr. May as well. According to the leaked audio, upon realizing the deception in the apartment, the teacher briefly confronted Xiao, before tragically sighing and muttering, "I'm already here." May as well. The fallout was catastrophic. Men were fired from their careers. Marriages disintegrated overnight. The psychological toll of having your deepest, most private vulnerabilities broadcast to hundreds of millions of mocking strangers drove many into total isolation. But the devastation was not merely social. It was biological. Medical reports eventually leaked indicating that at least 3 of Xiao's victims had tested positive for HIV following the exposure of the scandal. While it remains legally unclear if Xiao was the point of transmission, the local health authorities were forced to issue a terrifying, blanket public health mandate. They desperately urged any man who had engaged in intimate contact with the suspect to immediately seek aggressive medical screening. The mandate carried a horrific secondary warning: if the men had remained silent, terrified of the social stigma, they were now putting their unsuspecting wives and girlfriends at lethal risk. The victims were trapped between the terror of public exposure and the moral imperative to protect their loved ones. Xiao was dragged from his apartment in handcuffs, officially detained on charges of disseminating obscene content for profit. The investigation remains open, and the potential for a cascade of further, severe criminal charges hangs heavy over his head. The relentless churn of the internet cycle has already begun to move on. The memes have faded. The viral hashtags have been replaced. The digital mob has found a new target to consume. But for the hundreds of men who carried a watermelon down into that windowless basement, seeking a moment of human connection, the nightmare will never truly end. Their faces, their vulnerabilities, and their darkest secrets are permanently etched into the digital bedrock of the internet, waiting in the dark to be discovered all over again. Thank you for walking through the dark with me tonight, listeners. As you log off, as you lock your screens and retreat into your homes, remember this: the monsters of the modern age do not always hide in the woods. They do not always carry knives. Sometimes they are sitting quietly behind a keyboard, smiling at a webcam, pressing record. Stay vigilant. Guard your privacy. And above all, be careful who you trust in the dark. Good night. The faded Polaroids tucked into showboxes. We use cameras to capture joy, to freeze a perfect, fleeting second in time. A family laughing, a group of friends sharing a drink, a radiant smile. But a photograph only tells you the truth of a single fraction of a second. It cannot show you the heavy, suffocating silence of what happens after the flash fades. It cannot capture the predator standing just outside the frame, and it cannot warn the smiling subject that they are looking into the lens for the very last time. Tonight, we delve into two separate nightmares that are tethered together by the haunting legacy of the final photograph. Two stories where the boundary between absolute normalcy and profound, unfathomable violence was crossed in the blink of an eye. Our first descent into the dark takes us back to the bustling, fast-paced streets of 1982's London. The year is 1986. The setting is Fulham, a vibrant, affluent district in West London where the real estate market is moving at a breakneck speed. Amidst this chaotic, ambitious environment was a 25-year-old woman named Susie Lamport. Susie was a force of nature, born into a tight-knit, deeply loving family. Her three siblings described her as the absolute center of gravity in any room. She was energetic, fiercely sociable, and carried an adventurous spirit that infected everyone around her husband. She loved to travel, she was athletic, and she maintained the kind of busy, vibrant social calendar that defines your mid-20s. Susie was employed as an estate agent for a prestigious firm called Sturgis & Sons. Because she was striking, charismatic, and incredibly personable, her manager routinely positioned her desk right near the front window of the office. She was the welcoming face of the business, a bright beacon to attract potential clients walking down the pavement. The morning of July 28, 1996, began like any other ordinary Monday. Susie arrived at the office, a cup of coffee in hand, ready to tackle a busy schedule of property viewings. She flipped open her diary, scanning the appointments. But one entry, scrawled in her handwriting, stood out from the rest. At 12:45 p.m., she was scheduled to show a vacant residential property at 37 Shore Olds Road. The name of the prospective buyer, recorded from a prior telephone conversation, was listed simply as Mr. Kipper. In the United Kingdom, a kipper is a smoked herring, but in the gritty lexicon of British street slang, the phrase "to be done up like a kipper" carries a dark, specific meaning. It means to be severely cheated, to be tricked, to be taken advantage of by someone who has laid a trap. In the bright light of the office, surrounded by her colleagues, Susie likely chuckled at the bizarre surname. It was a quirk of the job, a funny anecdote to share over drinks later that evening. She grabbed her keys, gathered her paperwork, and stepped out into the mild London air. At around midday, Susie climbed into her white Ford Fiesta, turned the ignition, and drove towards Shore Olds Roads. She was driving directly into an abyss. A vacant house is a strange, liminal space. It is a structure devoid of life, echoing with the hollow sound of footsteps on bare floorboards. It is an environment built for isolation. According to eyewitness testimony, Susie arrived at the property shortly before her scheduled appointment time, but the quiet routine of unlocking a front door and waiting for a client was immediately shattered. A neighbor, living just next door to the property, happened to glance out of their window at approximately 1:00 p.m. They saw Susie standing outside the house on the pavement, but she wasn't alone, and she wasn't engaging in polite, professional conversation. She was locked in a heated, visible argument with a man. The neighbor provided a chillingly specific description of the stranger, which would later form the basis of a police identikit. The man was tall. He possessed dark, slicked back hair, swept away from his face. He appeared to be somewhere between 25 and 30 years old, and he was dressed immaculately in a sharp, charcoal grey suit. He looked like a wealthy professional, a man who belonged in a high-end estate agency. A third witness corroborating the scene reported seeing the exact same smartly dressed man talking with Susie outside the home. But this witness noticed a bizarre, incredibly unsettling detail. Cradled in the man's hands was a bottle of champagne, heavily decorated with thick, festive ribbons. Was the champagne a prop? A calculated tool designed to disarm a young woman? A psychological weapon to make him appear harmless, celebratory, and charming? Whatever transpired on that pavement, the timeline begins to fracture shortly after. At roughly 2:45 p.m., a close, personal friend of Susie's named Barbara Whitfield was walking along Fulham Palace Road. She glanced at the traffic and immediately recognized Susie's white Ford Fiesta driving north. Barbara smiled and waved enthusiastically at the passing car. But Susie never saw her. Barbara noticed that Susie was deeply engrossed in a conversation with a man sitting in the passenger seat of her vehicle. The car sped past, disappearing into the chaotic flow of London traffic. Back at the Sturgeson Sons office, the afternoon stretched on. Colleagues initially brushed off Susie's absence, assuming the viewing at Shorrold's Road had simply run long, or that the client had requested to see a second property. But as the clock ticked past 3:00 p.m., then 4:00 p.m., the atmosphere in the office shifted from casual assumption to gnawing, icy dread. Susie was a professional. She did not simply vanish during work hours without calling in. At 4:30 p.m., a panicked colleague drove to 37 Shorrold's Road. They found the property completely empty. The doors were locked. The house was silent. By 5:30 p.m., the police were formally notified. A 25-year-old woman had vanished into thin air in the middle of the day. As dusk fell over London, casting long shadows across the brick facades, the first physical piece of the nightmare was discovered. Susie's white Ford Fiesta was found abandoned on Stevenage Road, roughly a mile and a half from the property viewing. The scene inside the vehicle was a forensic puzzle that screamed of a sudden, forced disruption. The driver's side door was entirely unlocked. The handbrake had not been pulled up, and, most chillingly, the driver's seat had been pushed violently back on its tracks, shoved much further back than the petite, energetic Susie would have ever required to reach the pedals. Someone much taller had been sitting behind that wheel. Resting quietly inside the car was Susie's purse. It had not been a robbery. But there was absolutely no trace of Susie Lamplaw. As the investigation launched into a frantic, high-gear manhunt, a terrifying new witness account emerged from the shadows of Stevenage Road. A local resident came forward, claiming they had seen a dark-colored vehicle driving aggressively south along that very road around the time Susie evaporated. As the dark car sped past, the witness caught a fleeting glimpse through the glass. Inside the vehicle was a woman matching Susie's exact physical description. She was violently honking the horn of the car, and her face was contorted into an expression the witness could not definitively decipher. She was either laughing hysterically, or she was screaming in absolute, unadulterated terror. The police cast a massive net. They rigorously interrogated Susie's boyfriend and her male flatmate, definitively ruling both men out. Dozens of potential suspects were dragged into the blinding light of the interrogation room, only to be dismissed when their alibis held firm. But from the murky, criminal underbelly of the city, a true monster eventually stepped into the crusheress. His name was John Cannon. John Cannon was not a stranger to the dark. He was a convicted, predatory sex offender. In the months leading up to Susie's disappearance, the prison system had granted Cannon day release privileges, allowing a known predator to walk the streets of London before returning to his cell at night. The circumstantial evidence forming around Cannon was heavy and deeply disturbing. While serving his time, Cannon would frequently boast to his fellow inmates about his exploits on day release. He bragged about meeting a beautiful young woman at a local wine bar. He told the prisoners her name was Susie. Detectives interviewing Susie's co-workers uncovered a deeply unsettling detail that had occurred just days before she vanished. A completely anonymous, mysterious admirer had sent a massive, striking bouquet of blood-red roses directly to the estate agency, addressed to Susie. John Cannon had a well-documented, psychological signature. He was known to stalk women who caught his eye, and his preferred method of initial contact was sending them unsolicited deliveries of red roses. The timeline tightened around his neck like a noose. Cannon was officially released from prison a mere 3 days before Susie disappeared. He was documented to be roaming the Fulham area. Furthermore, a witness placed a man bearing a striking resemblance to Cannon standing on the pavement outside Sturgeson Sons on the very day of the abduction, his eyes peering hungrily through the glass window, directly at the desk where Susie was strategically positioned to attract clients. And then came the absolute, undeniable psychological link. When detectives interviewed Cannon's former prison acquaintances, they asked if the man went by any aliases or street names. The inmates nodded. They told the police that behind bars, John Cannon was universally known by a simple, distinct nickname. Gibber. The man who booked the appointment that lured Susie to her doom called himself Mr. Gibber. Despite the overwhelming avalanche of circumstantial connections, the British legal system requires a smoking gun. The police had no body, no murder weapon, and no physical evidence tying Cannon to the empty house on Shore Olds Roads Road. Without enough to charge him, Cannon remained free to roam the streets. And a predator never stops hunting. In 1987, a year after Susie was swallowed by the dark, Cannon joined a video dating agency, operating under the incredibly mundane alias John Peterson. The VHS profile video he filmed for the agency is a terrifying artifact of sociopathic detachment. Sitting in front of the camera, wearing a calm, polite facade, he speaks directly to the women he is trying to lure. Yes, I have a dislike of inflated egos, Cannon says softly into the microphone. People who look at me like I'm great. I don't like that. I can't handle that sort of inner weakness. I just like normal, average people. When the off-camera interviewer asks him about his sense of humor, Cannon offers a chillingly precise self-assessment. I'm a little bit dry as regards to humor, he smirks slightly. Yeah, that's how it is, mainly dry humor. His definition of dry humor was actually a manifestation of pure, psychopathic sadism. Just a few short weeks after recording that tape, John Cannon stalked, abducted, and brutally murdered a 29-year-old woman named Shirley Banks in Bristol. He transported her lifeless body into the dense, ancient woodlands of the Quantock Hills. He dumped her remains at a specific, remote geographic site. The location he chose was not an accident. It was a sick, twisted punchline to a joke only he understood. The site was historically known as Dead Woman's Ditch. When the authorities finally cornered and arrested Cannon for the murder of Shirley Banks, they tore apart his life. Inside his luxury BMW, they found the tools of a professional predator, an imitation handgun, and a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. When they breached his personal garage, they found Shirley's stolen car, but Cannon hadn't just hidden the vehicle. He had unscrewed the original license plates and attached a set of fake, counterfeit plates. The alphanumeric sequence on the fake plates read, SLP 300 Itexus seconds. To the detective staring at the metal, the code was a screaming, undeniable confession. Susie Lamplaw. Property. 3. Itexus the year she vanished. Yes. It was a trophy. A sick, arrogant badge of honor bolted to the car of his latest victim, openly mocking the police who had failed to catch him the first time. When detectives slammed the license plate onto the interrogation table and demanded an explanation, Cannon's arrogance was breathtaking. He smoothly lied, claiming he had purchased the vehicle from a businessman on the black market. He casually mentioned that this mysterious businessman was no doubt responsible for the slayings of Susie, Shirley, and another woman, and that this phantom figure was now in a great deal of trouble. The other woman Cannon referenced was Sandra Gould, a 27-year-old office worker brutally murdered in Bournemouth in 1996. Cannon was inserting himself into the narrative of multiple unsolved homicides, playing an infuriating game of cat and mouse with the detectives. While he successfully evaded official charges force and Gould Susie Lamplaw, the evidence for Shirley Banks was insurmountable. John Cannon was convicted of murder and slammed with a life sentence. As the heavy iron doors of the prison shut behind him, he reportedly smirked and stated that there were one or two things he was never caught for. Decades later, advancements in forensic technology allowed scientists to extract a microscopic trace of DNA belonging to Susie Lamplaw from deep within the upholstery of the Cannon's vehicle, but the courts deemed it insufficient to override the burden of proof required for a murder trial after so much time had passed. He was never formally charged. The senior investigating officer who dedicated his life to the case would later go on the record, stating with absolute, unwavering certainty that John Cannon was the man who took Susie. On November 6, 2024, John Cannon drew his final breath behind the cold stone walls of his prison cell. In his final hours, his own family begged him to show a single ounce of human mercy. They pleaded with him to reveal where Susie was buried, to give her grieving family a place to lay flowers. But Cannon was a predator to his core. He was a control freak who fed on the pain of others. He took his secrets into the fire. Nearly 40 years have eroded since that sunny July afternoon. Susie Lamplugh has never been found, but her legacy is not merely a ghost story. Her parents, channeling unimaginable agony into fierce determination, founded the Susie Lamplugh Trust, a massive, influential charity dedicated entirely to personal safety, stalking prevention, and protecting lone workers from the monsters walking among us. But before she was a headline, before she was the subject of a nationwide manhunt, she was just Susie. There is a photograph taken shortly before she drove to Shore Olds Road. It is a candid, beautiful image. It shows Susie standing shoulder to shoulder with her 3 siblings. Their heads are thrown back, their eyes crinkled in genuine, joyous laughter. It is a moment of pure, uninterrupted light. They are smiling, completely unaware that it is the very last time the 4 of them will ever be captured together in the light. Take a deep breath, listeners. Let the cold air of the city fade. For our second story, we leave the urban sprawl of London and travel to the stark, rugged beauty of the northern English coastline. It is the summer of 2017. The setting is the Cresswell Towers Caravan Park in Northumberland, a place of salty sea breezes, crashing waves, and the temporary escape of holiday makers. Richard Spotter's Wood, known to the criminal underbelly simply as Spotty, and his girlfriend, Lucy Byrne, had rented a caravan for a relaxing weekend getaway. In a spontaneous gesture of supposed goodwill, Richard picked up his mobile phone and invited his friend and employee, 24-year-old Darren Bonner, to join them by the sea. Darren, affectionately known to his friends as Zippy, was a young man existing on the absolute margins of society. He worked at a harsh, greasy auto garage owned entirely by Richard. The power dynamic between the 2 men was absolute and deeply exploitative. Richard paid the young man a pathetic, crushing wage of just $25 a day. In exchange for this grueling labor, Richard generously allowed Darren to live in a squalid, cramped mobile home parked on the dirty concrete directly outside the mechanic shop. But fixing cars was merely a front. Behind the oil stains and the heavy garage doors, Richard Spotter's Wood was a dangerous man. He was the architect of a massive, highly lucrative, and deeply illegal cannabis farming operation. The rumors on the street were that Richard paid Darren under the table, forcing the vulnerable young man to tend to the illicit corpse, pulling him deeper into a world of severe criminal consequence. But this weekend in Northumberland wasn't about the drug trade. It was a holiday, a chance to drink, laugh, and forget the grime of the garage. From July 7th to July 9th, the trio seemingly enjoyed the picturesque coastline. They drank heavily, socialized in the cramped living quarters of the caravan, and watched the tides roll in. At exactly 1:00 a.m. on the morning of July 10th, the 3 of them squeezed together on the narrow sofa of the caravan. They held up a smartphone and took a selfie. Look closely at the image in your mind. The flash illuminates their faces. They are smiling. They look like 3 friends, exhausted by alcohol and sea air, without a single care in the world. But the smiles are a liar. Within hours of that flash, the thin veneer of friendship would collapse into an abyss of horrific, tortuous violence. The sun rose over the rocky Northumberland coast. At just past 8:00 a.m., an early morning walker was enjoying the crisp air, strolling along a rugged path bordered by an old, ancient stone wall. As he walked, his ears picked up a strange, unsettling sound. It was a heavy, wet, guttural noise. The walker later described it to the police as the sound of loud snoring. But it wasn't rhythmic or peaceful. It was the horrific, ragged sound of a human body fighting desperately for oxygen. The walker cautiously approached the stone wall and peered over the edge into the brush. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. Dug directly into the cold, damp earth was an open, shallow grave. Lying at the bottom of the dirt trench was 24-year-old Darren Bonner. He was curled tightly into the fetal position, his knees pulled to his chest in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat. He had been violently stripped completely naked. He was shivering uncontrollably, his skin pale and bruised, his consciousness hanging by an invisible thread. The walker frantically dialed emergency services. When paramedics pulled the young man from the dirt, the sheer brutality of the attack became horrifyingly clear. Wrapped entirely around Doran's neck was a thick, angry, prominent red ligature mark. His torso was a canvas of deep, black and purple contusions. The doctors at the trauma center were horrified. Doran had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma, but the true killer was the oxygen deprivation. The violent strangulation, combined with the agonizing, prolonged exposure to the freezing coastal night air, had inflicted absolute, irreversible brain damage. For 16 agonizing days, Doran lay in a hospital bed attached to life support. The nursing staff, awed by his sheer will to survive such catastrophic injuries, nicknamed the young man Lionheart. But the damage was too profound. 16 days after being pulled from the earth, Doran Bonner's heart finally stopped. The police did not have to search hard for suspects. The trail led directly from the open grave to the door of the Cresswell Towers caravan park. The last of people seen with Doran were Richard Spot, his wooden Lucy Byrne. 3 days after the walker found Doran, detectives descended upon South Tyneside to bring the couple in for questioning. Richard did not cooperate. The moment he spotted the police cruisers, he slammed his foot on the accelerator, initiating a terrifying, high-speed chase through the streets. Realizing his vehicle was outmatched, Richard slammed the brakes, abandoned the car in the middle of the road, and fled on foot into the dense brush. He didn't make it far. The fierce, relentless barking of a police canine unit echoed through the trees, tracking his scent directly to a thick bush where the architect of the drug ring was found cowering in the dirt. Sitting in the sterile, fluorescent light of the interrogation room, Richard immediately began spinning a web of calculated, arrogant lies. He leaned back in his chair and scoffed at the detectives. He claimed that he and Doran were thick as thieves, best mates. He swore the atmosphere in the caravan was jubilant, pointing to the one, Jalroam's selfie as absolute proof of their unbreakable bond. According to Richard's first narrative, Doran had simply gotten drunk, wandered off into the dark Northumberland night to clear his head, and vanished. Richard played the role of the offended, grieving friend, absolutely outraged that the police would dare to accuse him of harming his employee. The detectives let him talk. They let him build his fragile house of cards. And then they produced the evidence that burned it to the ground. Realizing his wandering off story was dead on arrival, Richard pivoted. He concocted a new, infinitely more bizarre fiction. He leaned across the metal table and lowered his voice, telling the police a secret. He claimed that Doran was secretly dealing illegal, stolen firearms. According to Richard, Doran had smuggled a highly illegal Zono shotgun into the caravan park. In the middle of the night, Doran had demanded they walk out into the brush to dig a deep hole to stash the weapon. Richard, playing the loyal friend, graciously offered to help him dig. But while standing at the edge of the hole, Richard claimed Doran suddenly went mad, becoming physically violent and attacking him. Richard swore he merely defended himself, throwing a single, lucky punch that accidentally knocked Doran unconscious, causing him to tumble backward into the grave. When the detectives, staring at him in disbelief, asked why Richard had methodically stripped the unconscious man completely naked, Richard offered a pathetic shrug. "I panicked," he muttered. When asked to produce the phantom shotgun, Richard claimed he had driven it back to his garage, but some unknown thief had conveniently broken in and stolen it. The detectives had heard enough. They slammed a thick manila folder onto the table, overflowing with empirical, undeniable forensic truth. They had extensive CCTV footage showing Richard's specific van driving directly to the remote gravesite in the dead of night. They had crime scene photographs showing the interior of the rented caravan utterly destroyed, the walls and furniture bearing the unmistakable signs of a violent, desperate struggle for life. But the final nail in the coffin was found inside Richard's own vehicle. Stashed in the back of Richard's van were the clothes that had been stripped from Doran's body. Hidden alongside them was Doran's mobile phone, which had been intentionally, physically disassembled to prevent GPS tracking. And resting neatly in the glove box was a crisp, printed receipt. A receipt for a heavy-duty, steel-timed garden fork. The exact tool used to carve the shallow grave out of the hard coastal earth. The truth, as pieced together by the prosecutors, was a narrative of cold-blooded, cartel-style execution. Richard had grown intensely paranoid regarding his cannabis empire. He had convinced himself that his vulnerable, underpaid employee was actually a spy, secretly feeding intelligence to a rival, violent drug gang. That night in the caravan, fueled by paranoia and rage, Richard decided to make an agonizing example of the 24-year-old. A forensic autopsy painted a picture of absolute savagery. Richard had beaten Dawn mercilessly. He struck the young man no less than 12 times across the back with a heavy, solid, rod-shaped weapon. He then locked his thick arms around Darren's neck in a vice-like headlock, strangling the boy with such sustained, horrifying force that the tiny blood vessels in Darren's face literally burst under the pressure. And what of Lucy Byrne, the smiling girlfriend in the photograph? Initially, she played the fool, but facing the terrifying prospect of a murder charge, she flipped. She took the stand as a witness for the prosecution. She testified that she had been jolted awake in the early hours of July 10th by the sound of a horrific, violent road tearing the caravan apart. She looked at the jury and delivered a chilling quote. She testified that she had never seen her boyfriend look so evil. Lucy swore she did not witness the actual murder. However, she detailed the agonizing drive the following morning. As they fled the resort, Richard aggressively forbade her from looking into the rear compartment of the van. At one point, he pulled the heavy vehicle over to the side of the road, dangerously close to the stone wall where the walker would later find the body. Lucy testified that Richard dragged a massive, heavy object out of the back doors, disappearing into the coastal brush for 10 long minutes. When he returned to the driver's seat, he was drenched in a thick, feverish sweat. The police and the public harbored deep, lingering doubts regarding Lucy's innocence. It is difficult to fathom sleeping through an execution in a space the size of a tin can. Ultimately, the Crown determined there was insufficient evidence to prove she physically participated in the killing. The murder charge was dropped. She pleaded guilty to assisting an offender and was sentenced to a mere 30 months in prison. Richard Spottiswoode faced the full fury of the law. He was convicted of Darren's murder and slammed with a life sentence, mandated to serve a minimum of 22 years behind bars. The court ruled that they could not definitively prove premeditation. They classified the murder as a spontaneous explosion of violence resulting from an argument. But if you look at the timeline, a darker, far more terrifying theory emerges from the dirt. 3 days before the trip to the coast, Darren made a panicked phone call to his ex-girlfriend Donna. His voice was laced with pure terror. He told her, "I've fallen out with Spotty. He's gonna do me in. He's going to kill me." Darren was terrified. He was actively packing his bags, preparing to flee the town entirely. But later that exact same afternoon, Richard pulled up in his vehicle and offered the young man a ride to the holiday resort. Why did Darren get in the car? Did he believe he had been forgiven? Did the offer of a holiday convince him the threat was over? Or did he look at Richard and realize he simply had no choice but to obey them? Here is the detail that keeps investigators awake at night. Forensic archaeologists analyzed the shallow grave dug near the stone wall. The earth was hard, compacted, and filled with thick roots and rocks. They calculated that it would have taken a man of Richard's physical size roughly 1 full hour of grueling, continuous labor to dig a hole that size using a garden fork. But the CCTV footage tracking Richard's van in the middle of the night shows a very tight window of time. Too tight to beat a man near to death, strip him, drag him, and spend 60 minutes digging a hole before fleeing. Unless the hole was already waiting for him. What if Richard had driven to the coast earlier in the weekend, walked out into the brush, and methodically dug the grave while Darren was back at the caravan? If that theory holds true, it changes everything. It means the murder wasn't spontaneous. It means that, at exactly 1 a.m. when the three of them crowded together on that narrow sofa, pressing their faces together for the camera, Richard knew exactly what he was about to do. He smiled for the lens, wrapping his arm around a young man he knew was mere hours away from being thrown naked into a hole in the earth. If that is true, the photograph does not capture a normal moment turning dark. It captures the terrifying, cold-blooded creation of an alibi, a monster smiling with his prey, ensuring the world saw them as best friends right before he turned off the flash and turned out the lights forever. Thank you for listening. Keep your doors locked. Watch the shadows, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is right beside the person holding the camera. Good night.